Great. I do. Okay. Was it the not counting, just like 15 minutes from the movie. It's very long code, so yeah, it won't be one.
Hey, welcome everybody.
I'll be ready for it.
We are pleased to welcome all of you, both those of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining us virtually over Zoom to this hybrid event on the propaganda of the present with our guest who's come all the way from South Africa, Richard Pithouse, just to see us. So we're extremely thankful that he's made this journey, and hopefully he's had a few days to recover in Texas so that he's not fully jet lagged still. So we're gonna be throwing some tough questions at him because he has no excuses. My name is Yusuf Alushi, and I'm teaching in the Global International Studies Department here at UC Irvine. And today's event is really the final event of what has been a year-long seminar sponsored by the Sawyer Seminar Mellon Foundation, looking at the theme of Black Reconstruction as a portal, in which we've been taking up the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois and his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America, as a portal into our present moment to think through a whole series of problems, crises, political movements in different parts of the world. So thinking through and with Du Bois much more expansively, historically, and geographically up until the present, with particular attention to some of the themes that run throughout the book, themes like land, themes like labor, themes like education, like the strike. So I should thank all the people who've been involved with this seminar, starting with my co-organizer, Damien Sojourner in anthropology, and all of our fantastic team who are gathered here today. Marilyn Grell-Brisk, who is our postdoctoral fellow, Temi Tope-Famudu, and Mariel Rowland, who are our two PhD student fellows, as well as all the people who helped us in putting the organizing together. Melissa Valdez, Monica Rodriguez, Amanda Swain, and Ikwa Arhi, who've all been really fantastic managing all logistics for our many, many events and travelers and hybrid and Zoom logistics. So today's talk, titled The Propaganda of the Present, will be delivered by Richard Pithouse. And Richard Pithouse is an old friend, comrade. He is a scholar, journalist, editor, teacher, and activist working from Johannesburg, South Africa. He's taught philosophy and politics in South African universities since 1995, so almost 30 years. And he's published widely in academic journals and books. I'll mention just 3 recent examples. First one is this really incredible essay that came out in 2016, just when Trump was elected, titled Being Human Since 1942. Being Human After 1942. And it was published also as a pamphlet by Darja Press. It's really fantastic Pan-African publication forum, in which Richard is kind of thinking through the question of the human for the last 500 years, how the question of the human, who is not human, stands at the center of contemporary crises of authoritarianism as represented by people like Donald Trump. A second publication of his many, many publications I want to point out came out in 2022, I think just last year, in Critical Times, which is a really interesting journal trying to think about global critical theory. I think it's based out of Berkeley, I'm not totally sure. It's called Hit the Tire, so very much in conversation, I think, with UCHRI and a number of other initiatives. So Richard has a piece there called Hit the Tire, The Strike Mutates into a New Form. And it's a fantastic study of the form of the strike. It's a form of political intervention, of activism, and how it's mutating in the context of burning tires, particularly in South African protests, but in protests around the world, and how to understand the shifts in global capitalism and who the subject of resistance is, shifting from the factory to the streets that kind of burning tires represents in a mutation in the strike as form, and resonates a lot with our discussions around the general strike in Bois. A third recent piece of writing that I'm pretty sure we can attribute to him, although his name appears nowhere on it, and I'll bring it up in part because his name doesn't appear on it, and Richard has been involved with a number of publications and writings in which his name does not appear, and this is a really interesting way of challenging the commodification of ourselves that we're encouraged to do now in academia, to promote ourselves as thinker, to celebrate what Foucault told us to question, the notion of being an author. And I think Richard has been involved in a number of attempts to push back against that, right? Not putting one's name on pieces of writing. He's perhaps best known as a really rigorous and arguably South Africa's best thinker of Frantz Fanon. And he was involved, I'm pretty sure, in putting out one of the many reports that the Tricontinental Institute puts out on Frantz Fanon, The Brightness of Metal, which is just a fantastic overview of Fanon's life and ideas, kind of intellectual biography, thinking about Fanon as very much situated in concrete struggles and developing his philosophy from there. He's also the author of a book, Writing the Decline on Struggle for South Africa's Democracy, which came out with Jacana in 2016. And I'm just going to read to you a couple of things people say on the back of this. Achille Mbembe says, Richard Pithouse exemplifies what the project of writing the present is at its best. Sisonke Msimang says, Richard Pithouse is one of our finest essayists. He's the proverbial canary in the coal mine. And Sbuzi Kode, who spoke in our seminar just a few weeks ago, says, this is writing that dresses the oppressed in human clothing. So some really high praise from some really important figures. Richard's been a regular contributor to the media in South Africa for more than 25 years and has held positions as a columnist and editor-in-chief. He's also taught in trade union and social movement political schools and in other movement spaces over the same time span. He's done some work as a curator and has been a lifelong participant in popular struggles. Kind of a jack of all trades. You're not making the rest of us monotonous people look very good here. He's the executive director of The Forge, a space for public discussions, performance, and exhibitions in the heart of Braamfontein, Johannesburg's vibrant downtown student district. The Forge includes the Commune, a thriving radical bookstore and coffee shop. So if you're ever in Johannesburg, I think we have some people joining us potentially from Johannesburg, even though it's so late online here. Definitely check out this space. It's an amazing, amazing space that is really important for organizing and thinking. I haven't even mentioned that he also happens to be a deep thinker of music, of poetry. He wrote a wonderful obituary of Johnny Clegg. He's a big fan of people like Mahmoud Darwish. So that he thinks across the board. And at his core, I think, as I just said, he's really a thinker of and with and participant in movement. So perfect for what we've been trying to do in the seminar. Our discussant today is our fantastic Rudo Mudiwa, who we are so happy has joined UCI's campus, which has already opened up a range of really important spaces for thinking and collaboration on this campus, including a fantastic event she just organized yesterday by Kemi Adeyemi, Book Talk. And Rudo is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies here. Broadly speaking, she's interested in thinking through the promise and practice of invention for Black people. How do we make new ways of being in the world and with each other? Her attempt to answer this question frequently returns to the politics of public space and mobility, particularly for Black women. She's working on her first book titled A Nation of Prostitutes, Gender Policing and the Invention of Zimbabwe. This book will examine how the prostitute, a symbol of the mobile and transgressive Black woman, came to express anxieties regarding the challenge of remaking urban space, gender relations, and the state itself in the aftermath of 90 years of colonial rule in Zimbabwe. Along with her scholarly work, her writing has also appeared in Transition, Chimurenga, New Frame, which Richard happens to have served as the editor for, Ebony and Africa as a country. So we're really happy to have Rudo with us today, and we're happy that she's been with us pretty much all year long at pretty much every event that we've organized. So thank you, Rudo, for being here. So with that, I will turn it over to Richard Pithouse. Apologies for taking up so much time, but we're all really excited to hear what you have to offer us today.
Okay, well, thanks, Joseph. It's all very kind. And thanks to Joseph and Damien for the invitation. It has been a remarkable series. I've not watched the ones that are on like 3 in the morning at home, but I have watched the other ones, and it's been amazing. There's been a lot of thought on it. That matters. That really matters. Thanks also to David Goldberg for lunch and our conversation. So, yeah, the propaganda of the present. I want to begin with a one-liner from Fanon, which encapsulates the essence of what I want to say today. And it's this, from Black Skin, White Masks. I want the world to recognize with me the open door of every consciousness. I want the world to recognize with me the open door of every consciousness. There's something strictly axiomatic about that, something universal. So, in Black Reconstruction, Bois, a scholar denied, wrote, from the margins of the American Academy, but from the center of a struggle. It's important, margins of the Academy, center of a struggle, to recover and affirm a history denied, the history of people who, he repeatedly notes, had their humanity denied. The scale, detail, and brilliance of the work, along with its magnificent passages and moments of luminous poeticism, steadily accumulate an incontrovertible weight, a weight that cannot be denied. It's, of course, amongst those great books that puncture the consensus and mean that discourse after that has a before and an after. And, you know, Fanon, who wrote 2 books that did that, ended his last book as he was dying in Tunisia with the injunction to work out new concepts. I mean, that's at the heart of what an intellectual has to do ultimately. Now, Du Bois doesn't give names to his concepts always. He says something, he doesn't like brand them, but they're there in the book. And they're a set of analytic tools that we can, as Joseph said, is the whole point of this series of talks, bring into the present. We can do that with these tools. Now, of course, contemporary radical analysis, and I'm thinking here particularly of the incredibly generative work of Whitney Wilson Gilmore, has often focused on the notion of abolition democracy. As Joseph said, there's been a lot of focus on the idea of the general strike. All of this remains intensely relevant, including the focus, of course, on the need for a material basis for freedom and the need for the political force to defend democracy against property and racism and their intersection. And of course, for Du Bois, that the basis of that material force is land, something that certainly in South Africa is very relevant. But I want to talk about something different. I want to look at the Du Bois's examination of the ways in which Black political and social agency over the 20-year span that encompassed the American Civil War and the Reconstruction era came to be denied by what he called the propaganda of history. The last chapter is the propaganda of history. That is a fundamental point of the book. And I want to, accepting the invitation from Joseph and Damien, think about how we could apply that to South Africa now. And I'm really looking at a period from 2004 to, say, 2014 or so. But I think it's some things that happened there can be illuminated. by using Du Bois. So of course, Du Bois was trained with the best possible university education available at the time in the world as a sociologist and as a historian. And he was very committed to bringing the most possible rigor to the study of important questions, including, most famously what he called the color line that belts the world. That set him against the constitutive feature of modernity. Working with the system, with the flow of things. He set himself against a force that is absolutely key to the shaping of the modern world. A force that is legitimated by science with all its authority, and sustained by what Fanon called Manichaean delirium. In other words, science and official knowledge can also be madness. You've got to be very careful, it's not about like anti-vax paranoia. But on that question of racism, delirium imagined itself as reason, and often still does. So, he began with his 1899 book, The Philadelphia Negro, study of, pioneering text in sociology, but also in urban studies, where he tried to use these techniques. And they weren't just neutral tools. He affirmed his ethical and political commitment there, the idea of a common humanity. And he noted that movement towards this ideal was one in struggle. He said, and sometimes in these beautiful turns of phrase, the world has glided by blood and iron into a wider humanity. Now, I want to argue that in terms of, he took up those scholarly techniques in service of what in fact was a long-established ethical and political project, constitutive of what Cedric Robinson would later call the Black tradition. So, you could go back far and you could come back into the present looking at these things. But just to take two examples, in 1792, Toussaint Louverture had excoriated the slavers in the eyes of humanity. That was the language, and would repeatedly affirm his commitment to a universal humanity as both empirical fact and ethical obligation. And for Frederick Douglass, who regularly affirmed the need for an adequate idea of humanity. We don't only find this in theory up to today, and it is it's there in theory that's been published right now. I'm thinking of, say, Hugo Cannon's new book published with Jude, but also in Johannesburg. It's there too in popular struggle. So think about Fanny Lavalas, the movement in Haiti that opposed the dictatorship at incredible cost for a very long time. Eventually brought Jean-Bertrand Aristide to power, defended that political breakthrough. Think about Abehlali Asimjondolo in South Africa, movement of the urban poor, more than 100,000 strong, been going since 2005, also confronting horrific oppression. Last year, they lost 3 of their best young leaders to assassination, and another person was murdered in his home by a masked police officer. Both of these organizations take the affirmation of the human as central to what they do. They say it all the time. So it gives people political clarity and courage. With Lavalas, there's a famous statement, tout more, some more, not that I can pronounce Haitian or Creole, but it means a person is a person. It's a statement of obvious African roots. You have very similar things in Africa. Very similar statements in Abehlali. There's a universalism there. So this question of who is counted as fully and equally human is central to Black Reconstruction. Du Bois writes that America withdrew the name of humanity for the vast majority of human beings. And he sees reason, philanthropy, and science as key legitimators of this. Very, very importantly for the argument I want to make, he begins Black Reconstruction with a statement of method. I wouldn't get you through a research committee in any university I've taught at, but it is the most profound method, I think, in any humanities project. He says, I'm going to tell the story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings, he's going to tell the story as though the people he's writing about are ordinary human beings. He takes care to explain the epistemological necessity of that axiom. It is not solely ethical. He says, can we imagine the spectacular revolution when in blood and servile war, freedom came to America? And he says, we can't if we don't think of these people as human beings like ourselves. But by assuming the common humanity of these people, we can conceive of what happened. Because it's not just ethical. You can't understand the world adequately if you don't recognize humanity in universal terms. Importantly, he immediately observes that what he calls this attitude, in other words, assuming that Africans are ordinary human beings, will from the first seriously curtail my audience. This is not someone writing to be popular. He understood that what Jean-Paul Sartre would later call in the context of Semitism an a priori commitment to, quoting here, reasoning based on passion, of racial passion that overwhelms any endeavor to ground reason in a serious attempt to apprehend empirical reality, would make a rational engagement with his intervention impossible. So in other words, being rational makes it impossible for many potential readers to engage what you're doing rationally because they are overwhelmed at a level of emotion and passion by what phenomenon. So it's not a small thing, you know, entering the terrain constituted by what Lewis Gordon often calls unreasonable reason is you're taking the risk of being scorned, dismissed as irrational, unscientific, even disparaged as producing fraud. Remember Fanon's anguish. When I was present, it being reason, was not. When it was there, I was no longer. Now, a commitment to engaging all people as ordinary human beings is a commitment to universal equality. And there's a long philosophical tradition to understanding very well that affirmations of equality will be met with ridicule. In 1675 or 76, I don't think people are quite sure exactly what year, Spinoza wrote that those who confine to the common people the vices which exist in all human beings will perhaps greet my contentions with ridicule. It's a long time ago. However, he says all men have the same nature. Jacques Rancière, obviously writing now, says those who think they are clever and realist can always say that equality is only the fanciful dream of fools and tender souls. But unfortunately for them, it is a reality that is constantly and everywhere attested to. Of course, you have to be in the places where people use humanity as disparaged to see that as constantly and everywhere attested to. Now, in his biography of Du Bois, David Levering-Lewis remarks that contemporary readers will contemplate with astonishment that Du Bois had deemed it necessary to explain that he would tell his story as though its subjects were ordinary human beings. For Levering-Lewis, this is something past, it's astonishing. Now, that's very odd because, you know, I mean, the year after Levering-Lewis published the first volume of his biography, Sylvia Wynter wrote an incredibly important essay, No Humans Involved, which among other things was an argument that what she called the classificatory logic of the academy was sustaining the idea that people could be more or less human, even totally lacking in humanness. Now, this question of how the count of the human is made remains intensely relevant in the academy and in struggle. You know, Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore asks us to understand how a category of dehumanized humans is made from peculiar combinations of dishonor, alienation, and violent domination. Shilembembe writes that for the democratic project to have, any future at all, it should necessarily take the form of a conscious attempt to retrieve life and the human from a history of waste. And when he writes like that, from the pinnacle of the global academy, he sounds very much like a grassroots activist in Abishlali or from others. And Spuzo Kore from Abishlali, Joseph mentioned him now, often speaks of the ongoing vandalization of humanity. I find that also a powerful concept. And he's basically saying what Gilmore said, but in different language. So how is dehumanization achieved? How is it legitimated? How is it reinscribed? Well, theories of propaganda often focus on material forms of power. So think about Noam Chomsky's propaganda model. It's about media ownership, concentration, power of advertisers. And Du Bois is a materialist in many ways. He looks at that. He says, under race, they camouflage the dictatorship of land and capital. He says that the dictatorship of capital must maintain ascendancy by controlling the public opinion of the laboring classes. But he also examines ideology in other terms, including famously the sort of public and psychological wage that compensated white workers for their low monetary wages, and as a result functions to keep those wages low. And he does something else that is not always done. He notes both formal and informal, open and covert ways in which ideology is made and sustained, ranging from the power to influence public opinion through the prestige and wealth, news, and literature, to the covert exercise of force and the psychology of vague and unknown ill, the innuendo that cannot be answered, for it's not openly published. These are things that are not usually taken seriously. He looks at the records left by white society during Reconstruction. He notes relentless charges of corruption and theft, wholesale lying, ridicule, sneering at beauty, listening without ears, presenting demands for equality as insane. And the presentation of white people committed to equality as sentimental Philistines. And in a phrase that is interesting in terms of what it says about gender, liberty intoxicated ladies given to poetical infusion. Now, some of this is animated, he says, by the old snobbery of class judgments and by elitism, but racism festers at the heart of the matter. He says the Black freedman has been threatened with hard and callous judgments, hardened with hate. He says South has been taught to look at the Negro as a thing apart from other human beings. And there he's anticipating, as he often does, work to come. In this case, I think of Amy Césaire or Michel Rolfe Trio. Important dimension of this is the relentless denial of autonomy. Whenever we see a Negro, we presuppose a master. If he's written something of value, it must have been written by a white friend. Relentless denial of autonomy and agency. There's also the kind of materiality of scholarship, denial of funding to Black students, while white Southerners can get quick funds to attack and ridicule the Negro and his friends. The editor that refuses to print. A key point in this particular academy is that he says the chief witness in Reconstruction, the emancipated slave, has been barred from the archive, with records mostly not made and those not destroyed, just ignored. The testimony that exists is just ignored in this academic project. Now, he concludes that aiming to write a rational evidence-based history that assumes that the people being studied are ordinary human beings means that one must write an incredible line in a field devastated by passion and belief. Field devastated by passion and belief. Of course, against this, he opposes reason, what Lewis Gordon calls reasonable reason. He says he sets some standards of ethics in research and interpretation. He's not giving up on the academy, he's contesting it, trying to make it reasonable. Now, when we bring this to South Africa, as this series has asked everyone to bring Du Bois into the work they do, the place that they think from. We could speak about the differences between the US in 1865 and South Africa at the moment of transition in 1994, at great length. The key thing is that unlike the Confederacy, apartheid was not militarily defeated. There was a stalemate, and in the end, that stalemate was resolved at the end of the Cold War with a negotiated transition. And that transition resulted in terms of formal politics. It's always had a different underside. In a liberal economic and political system that secured the rule of capital, replaced popular aspirations with a transfer of land, capital, power, with human rights and elections, all anchored by what Du Bois, again anticipating many critiques to come, called the metaphysical fetish worship of the Constitution. It's incredibly appropriate to post-apartheid South Africa. Now, in this new order, they had the state and the ANC as one legitimate, the ANC being the ruling party, one legitimate form of power and knowledge production, the media, civil society, which I'll speak about in a moment, and the academy. And when new struggles began to emerge to challenge that compromise, this is where knowledge was produced, authorized, distributed, and archived from those four key forces. And the moment came in 2004, where people who had been excluded from the elite public sphere, people who were not given voice, people who were always spoken for and about, not given a space to speak for themselves, so, just took the political stage. And this was via a sequence of popular protests all over the country, mostly organized from shack settlements and mostly taking the form of road blockades. Now, the shack settlement for Lancet in 1961 is seen as, they are seen as places of ill fame, peopled by women and men of evil repute. That remains true in South Africa and many parts of the world. But one thing I think that's particularly important to understand in South Africa is that for many people, there's an assumption that people living in a shack settlement who may not have had much formal education, who may come from a rural area, are seen as pre-modern, as people who are not fit subjects for participation in modern democracy, who, if they are to be engaged rather than repressed, must be engaged always to be trained, to be taught. That's how they must always be engaged. Pre-modern, it's very important. So in Durban, a movement emerged out of that sequence of protests. We've mentioned it before, Abekline. And when a movement emerges, it's different to just protests, because over time, over consistent organization, movements enable people to get access to voice in the public sphere. And that becomes an epistemological challenge, and in some cases also a legitimation challenge for authorized forms of political representation and meaning. Now, in the university, an alliance between the academy and the NGO nexus, an intensely racialized mode of power at that time, it was often assumed that when impoverished people broke with the authority of the former liberation movement, they would transfer that to intellectuals, most of whom at that time were not African, in that NGO university nexus. It didn't happen. The movement insisted on its autonomy and affirmed the politics of humanism and a demand for the respect and affirmation of their dignity. So in Sylvia Winter's phrase, famous phrase of, she says, being human is a praxis. That's a really good summation of the politics that emerged. And Nick Brommel in his book on Frederick Douglass talks about the dignity displaying and dignity affirming relations with others, dignity displaying and affirming that was central to Frederick Douglass's idea of praxis. That's also an incredibly good sort of pithy explanation of what's going on with these new forms of politics, dignity displaying and affirming. This emerging politics insisted that people must be recognized as competent to think, speak, and decide for themselves, and to assert their rights to do so. Began by asserting that against the ANC. People say, we think, we must be recognized as people that think. You'll see that on YouTube from the early videos from that time. They took it very seriously within the movement. People don't dislike for other people within the movement. But they also operationalized that principle as a practice when they had to engage the state and also the NGOs and the academics. Now, as a principle, I think the dominant response in the academy was just scorn, something that Du Bois helps us to understand. So this is just naive, it's pre-political, it's just nonsense, it's not serious. Why aren't you talking about the World Bank? There was an American academic in South Africa who literally said that, why are you not talking about the World Bank? But of course, his humanity is not being called into question. But when operationalized as a practice, it resulted in intense hostility from the ANC, the state, but also that NGO academic complex. So I don't think anyone in this room will be surprised knowing, what you do about the pathologies of the state in general, but also the post-colonial state, that the ANC responded by declaring people criminals and saying that their rebellion could only have been as a result of what here in the US you call Mudiwa, but is called an outside agitator. And it was assumed that the outside agitator had to be white. This is the thing with a long history. If you read Trio's book on silence in the past, on the Haitian Revolution, it's the same thing, the slaves were happy, why they were rebelling? There must be some white person who told them to do it. I mean, delirium, madness. So I'll move on from the states, aside from saying that that's how they understood it, and that they were incredibly violent. Now, the media is a different thing. In South Africa, the media and civil society, which I'm putting in inverted commas, are seen in the elite public sphere, by the dominant kind of consensus there, as the key democratic actors. It's the media and the NGOs that are the true democratic actors. They really represent and defend democracy. Now, that's obviously incredibly naive, and I think people will know how commercial media functions. I want to just give one quick example. It's illustrative. It's an article that was published just to show how, what the character of the media actually is. Published in July 2021, written by a guy called Jeff Wicks. And I'm not going for low-hanging fruit here. This is a guy who recently won a prestigious award for journalistic excellence. He's affirmed as a really good journalist. Excellent. It was published in News 24, biggest publication in the country, which was last month awarded the title Best News Website in Africa, by the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers. Now, Wicks and his editor, Adrian Besson, they're both white guys. News 24 is owned by Naspers, which is a very powerful organization in Afrikaner capital. As it was previously known, Die Nationale Pers, it ran a stable of pro-apartheid newspapers through the whole apartheid period. And before then, in the 1930s, they literally had Nazi affiliations. I don't mean Nazi as a euphemism, or not a euphemism, sorry, synonym for fascism. I mean Nazi, like German fascism, Nazism. Now, this article by Wicks asserts as fact that gunmen, members of a criminal gang, armed with ammunition previously stolen by rampaging looters, fired on the police in the Maglala informal settlement in Durban. And he writes, officers were taking rifle and handgun fire from all directions. Police vehicles were peppered by gunfire. And of course, under this attack, the police had no choice but to return fire. And in the mire, a 33-year-old woman was killed. The woman is not named. She's not even named. These are people with money, the easiest thing in the world for them to go there, find her name, and so on. No one who lives there is invited to comment. The two people who are invited to give comments are both white people. They're both, people who operate in that kind of NGO space who have no knowledge of what actually happened. The woman is not named. Not a single source is given for the story. It's just asserted as facts. It doesn't say with information culture. Obviously, you got this from cops, but complete abandonment of any kind of journalistic standards. Remember, Du Bois focused on standards. Now, on 3 separate occasions since the publication of that article, the actual facts of the matter have been placed in the public domain, although always from marginal sources, but very credible. The actual facts are as follows. Heavily armed police and soldiers descended on the Maglala shack settlement. They did not have search warrants, and they've broken into people's homes looking for stolen goods and scapegoats, and taking goods for which residents could not produce receipts, mostly food. This in a country in which half of the people regularly go to bed hungry, and more than a quarter of children have stunted growth due to malnutrition. I live in South Africa. The police and the soldiers never burst into my house with guns and took my food. It's unimaginable if they would. Now, what happened is that residents began shouting at the police. They were very angry, and the police had done the same thing the day before, and some threw stones. So to be clear, no one fired on the police and the soldiers. They opened fire. They killed Zamkele Shangas, that was her name. She was actually 32. As it happened, she was not part of the crowd. She was standing up on a hill beside her shack when she was shot. She was an unemployed mother. She had 2 children, and she was an important person in her community. She'd been elected to serve a year's term on the local council. In a press statement, the movement said, as usual, we are spoken about and not spoken to. As usual, we are criminalized. As usual, our lives count for nothing. Now, there's a long history of police lying. Sorry, I'm supposed to be quoting. There's a long history of the police lying to cover up their actions and the media taking their lies as if they were facts without bothering to talk to eyewitnesses. This is Du Bois's propaganda model. Lies taken as facts. You don't even speak to the people who were there. Now, it's impossible to imagine that the police and the army would shoot the middle class or any white woman like that. It's even more impossible. I don't know. It's so impossible, I don't think you can even engage in comparisons. If a middle-class white woman was shot by the police or the army, it's utterly impossible to imagine that News 24 would report it like this. It would be the biggest story for months. They would keep coming back to it. They've never bothered to correct this article, to send a journalist there to fix it. They've never apologized. This is just utter contempt for the lives of certain people. Utter contempt. Now, I want to talk about civil society. It's a key actor. There's a sequence of mass popular organization in South Africa that did more than anything else to bring down apartheid. Begins 50 years ago in Durban with a series of strikes, 1973, by Black workers. Moves on to the Soweto uprising in 1976, the formation of the United Democratic Front in 1983, kind of mass alliance of popular organizations, the growing insurrection through the 80s. And it comes to an end with the release of Mandela in 1990 and the demobilization of the UDF the following year. During and after that transition, it was subject to a 2-pronged containment strategy. One is that Western donors, following a model first developed in Eastern Europe, set up NGOs restricted to a human rights framework, and then the idea is that they substitute themselves for power in the name of civil society. So civil society is supposed to represent the people. It's actually NGOs. You know, NGOs are staffed usually by people with a senior level master's degrees. They report to boards, boards report to funders. They have no popular base, no mandate, no membership. At the same time, trade unions were brought into corporatist arrangements, and various popular organizations subject to the top-down authority, the ANC. Decisive shift from popular to NGO and state politics. The people, as Fanon observed in 1961, were sent back to their caves. Now, remember, Du Bois said science, reason, and philanthropy. He didn't talk about the NGO because it's a new form, but philanthropy, presented uncritically as a good, is part of the means of producing a propaganda of the present, and it's fundamentally anti-democratic in the name of democracy. It's not always easy for people to understand that civil society is problematic like this. I mean, it's not uncommon for American scholars and students who are radical at home to mediate their networks in Africa, their connections, through these kinds of organizations, even to present liberal NGOs as radical. I've never actually quite understood the logic behind that. I mean, a liberal NGO in Africa, they would never do it here. Like, I don't know, you can tell me. But there are some very good critiques. I think Asif Bayat, Arthur Chatterjee, the very important feminist critique from Sangtin writers, and Richard Nagar in India. There are some good critiques. I want to go back to Haiti because I find that the resonance is so powerful. And to Peter Horwitz' brilliant book, Damming the Flood. First thing he says about civil society in Haiti: the provision of white enlightened charity to destitute and allegedly superstitious blacks is an all too familiar neo-colonial pattern. It is. I also want to say that, you know, There are different kinds of NGOs, and we need to be clear about how they're categorized and so on. But the idea, and there are left NGOs that are able to work with popular movements, like they use Freirean methods or they liberation theology, but very often left NGOs have not. Forward says in Haiti, these NGOs tend not to organize with and among the people in the places and on the terms where the people are strong, but they prefer trivial made for media demonstrations, usually attended by tiny groups of people. It's exactly what happens in South Africa. Exactly. And you could add the language. These NGOs are operating, they're not operating the languages people speak either. He also shows how, like Action Aid, which is considered a left NGO in South Africa, when the coup happened in 2004, the US-backed coup, organizations like Action Aid supported that coup. And across the world, including in South Africa, the media took these tiny civil society organizations, presented them as if they were democratic actors, and legitimated the coup against an elected government in the name of democracy with the support of these organizations. You can have any position you want on Family Lavelas or Aristide, that's not my point. My point is that it's an elected government. How the hell do small, usually Western funded organizations get to substitute for the Haitian people? That's the question. And it's almost illicit to answer. It's almost heretic. It doesn't work very well for you if you ask that question, not in terms of career. Now, Howard makes another very, very important point. He looks at a small organization, and I don't know how to pronounce it, W.E.B. He says a tiny political organization that was like any number of neo-Trotskyite sects, militant and inconsequential in equal measure. It's a bloody useful phrase, but had nonetheless been very prominent on the international left, even though it has no base. Doesn't represent anyone, like all these organizations. It slandered popular mobilization in a manner as virulent as anything by the right. This became invaluable propaganda for that sector of civil society wanting to legitimate them. So the small sectarian left organization, there's no capacity to mobilize, organize, there's no legitimacy to represent, but it's functional for oppression in alliance with the civil society organization. What they're for in the future is very divergent. One is for liberalism, one is for socialism. What they're for in the present, the hostility to ordinary people entering the political terrain, they've got an alliance on that. There's a big literature on debates on leftism, but I do want to quote Fanon again. He talks of the kind of project that wants to erect a framework around the people that follows an a priori schedule. And intellectuals that come down into the common parts of real life with formulas that are sterile in the extreme. You can't mobilize if you do that. What do you do if you can't mobilize? Well, sometimes you might give into the temptation to delegitimate what you can't control, what makes your politics look what it is, which is non-viable. In South Africa, left NGOs have often assumed a right to represent or take decisions for popular organizations, often tried to use donor funding to exercise control over them. They've often sought to bypass or undermine elected structures and leaders. They've often tried to make deals with individuals that don't have elected positions, financial deals to try and get influence or control. There's often been intense hostility to assertions of autonomy and demands for respectful and mutual engagement. And that's gone on to include things like baseless allegations of criminality, corruption, slander, and engaging the media to attack people who don't accept your authority. So the academy is the other force that makes meaning. And I think it's really important to understand that in that period of this mass mobilization from 73 onwards, university-trained intellectuals often were able to engage it very productively and play an important and valuable role in this. And at that time, the key text that those intellectuals thought about praxis in terms of was Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, published in 68. Steve Biko introduced that text to South Africa. He ran workshops on it. And it's all about mutuality. Freire was very inspired by Fanon. In fact, he rewrote his book after reading Fanon. Fanon is committed to this. He talks about the prospect of a mutual current of enlightenment and enrichment between the university-trained intellectual and the grassroots militant. Mutual current of enlightenment and enrichment. Now, after the ANC took power in '94, most of those intellectuals went into the NGOs or the states. And this commitment to mutuality as a basis for praxis wasn't completely lost, but it was lost to a very significant degree. Other kinds of forms of engagement came to the fore. One was NGO substitutionism. Another was that NGOs, if they didn't run organizations, should at least give them political direction. There was a growing influence of, and Yosef has written about this, of previously completely marginal forms of sectarian left politics linked to, organizations in the US and in the UK. That had been marginal in the past, but now became influential. There was also in Durban just straight up thuggery from the mid-90s, demagogic thuggery in the academic year. It's a serious problem with race. There were many different kinds of networks that saw themselves as a vanguard. They didn't have one single African person in them. All white people, or maybe white people, and in South African racial terminology, a couple of Indian people, absolute assumption of a right to lead and give direction, and intense hostility when asked about this. Like, who chose you guys? Who gave you this authority? It was very hard for this generation of academics, which in terms of organizing and practice is a failed generation of left academics, to grasp that impoverished people didn't come out of some kind of nullity, political nullity, that they came out of political histories and networks and ideas. It was in truer sense unthinkable. Now, as a result, what Du Bois equips us to understand well, a priori frameworks substitutes it very frequently for what Du Bois called serious research. You didn't have to go and talk to people and say, what are your political histories? Was your grandfather involved in the Bambata Rebellion? Was your father part of the Pondo Revolt? Was your mother involved in the women's riots in the shack settlements, Cato Manor in 1956? Were you in the UDF? Do you have a background in trade unions? Was your high school teacher in the Black consciousness movement? There's a million ways in which people have political history. It just didn't exist. So the assumptions were often spontaneity. People just spontaneously one day woke up and, went to block a road. And that often actually took a form that was biological, which is very disturbing. So, it appeared in the terms that the great English historian E.P. Thompson called spasmodic. It's almost like a physical reaction. And you think about that in terms of race and racism, it's very disturbing. But just like the state, this absolute assumption that the only explanation for people organizing and for organizing in a way that doesn't conform to what you want them to do has to be a white person telling them what to do, just relentless. Now, the struggle to understand that an impoverished African person living in a shack could be what Gramsci called a historical person, the protagonist, just was entrenched. And it was widely assumed in Rancière's words that only groans or cries expressing suffering, hunger, or anger could emerge, but not actual speech. If there's speech, it's because a white person wrote it, or a white person trained an African person to say something on television. I'm not making this up, you can go and check the record. And Du Bois equips us to understand some of what happened then, because we don't tend to talk about this stuff. We tend to talk about the formal record. But scorn, slander, contempt, an inability to recognize the political capacities of oppressed people, attempts at public delegitimation, just oceans of gossip, and also outright intimidation of people producing academic and journalistic work that was engaged on actual engagement with these new forms of struggle. For a while, white authored documents, taking very much the same form as standard attempts at delegitimation all over the world by intelligence agencies. That's the tactic of scattering in a few facts here and there with chunks of outright fabrication, were produced and circulated, ranked with colonial tropes, the same themes obsessively returned to. Impoverished African people do not have independent political capacities. The reports of intellectuals that have affirmed these capacities are fraudulent. There must be someone else telling them what to do. Now, serious allegations were made, even including murder. But I just want to give one illustrative example of the kind of stuff that appeared in these texts. So, in one of them, it's asserted, this is by someone who's done no research. That's critical. Think about Du Bois. You just know, so you just say, you don't have to go and check reality. So, Abishlali wear red shirts, they have red banners, their color's red, okay? Now this guy says, no, they don't understand the political meaning of the color red. This was imposed by white and Indian intellectuals. Now, what actually went down was very interesting, because when Abishlali organized its first legal march, they'd done road blockades and stuff before, they asked a guy called Faisal Khan, who was an academic. He was forced out of the academy for his politics, to help him with some of the practicalities, because he was a very experienced activist, in particular finding a place to get cheap t-shirts. There's no donor funding for this stuff that they can print their slogans on. Faisal did as he was honest and found some cheap t-shirts that were powder blue. So if you look at the early pictures and video footage, you'll see people wearing powder blue t-shirts. Then after the march, which was a real success, there was a discussion in the movement about, they always do this, they still do it, like a reflection, what went right, what went wrong, what can we learn? And in that discussion, Mzwakhe Mjalos, who was at one point the deputy president of the movement, who has a background in trade unions, said to Faisal, with great affection and respect, and really appreciate your help. But I think in future, we really must have red shirts, because that's the color of the left. And there was a discussion about it, about trade unions, the Communist Party, and from then on the shirts were red. So actually an academic asked to help, got them blue shirts. They asked for red, but then you get this text written by someone who wasn't in the meeting. He just affirms this. And this shit is cited all over the place, including by people with degrees from very fancy American universities. Prior to reading Black Reconstruction, rereading it in preparation for this talk, I would have said it's astounding that this kind of stuff is cited. But thinking about Du Bois, it actually makes sense. That's his model of propaganda. Assumption, rumor, fabrication, making its way into the academy. And that's what has happened. Now, you could explain this in terms of like Thomas Quimby's idea of the paradigm shift, which Alden Morris, who wrote The Scholar Denied, says, he's got this little summary. The scientific community develops conservative interests in support of the dominant paradigm and will fight to continue enjoying the fruits of their regimes. They'll work to prevent the success of scientific insurgents. Warfare in science is normal. Okay, that explains how things can get hectic, not very hectic in Durban. I mean, real thuggery, intimidation, harassment. But that can't be the whole story. And Morris notes this. He notes Pierre Bourdieu's observation that scientific works are contaminated by the position of the authors in social hierarchy. And when you think about what happened in that period, 2004 to 2014, what academics who had power did to people like students and academics with much less power to control the narrative, actually amounted to taking very serious professional risks, citing fraud, supporting and aligning yourself with thuggery, ignoring texts and other kinds of archives and records. This is what Du Bois talks about, of course, too, that just don't fit the narrative. Not doing research. if you call to account on those things, your professional reputation can be seriously damaged. So you can't say that they were just doing it to protect professional turf. It has to be that what the boys called passion. Remember, field devastated by passion and belief was overwhelming them in a way that they were willing to actually take those kinds of professional risks. Now, the texts that are there make the nature of the passion clear enough, but gossip is central to the propaganda model developed by Du Bois. And in some ways, it's more revealing than text. People give things away in gossip. It can illuminate an unconscious, political unconsciousness. Prior to rereading Black Reconstruction, I just left gossip over there as that shit over there. I want to think about it politically now. And I want to give you, look, we need a serious anthropological study of gossip in the academy in South Africa and how it shapes knowledge. I mean, it would be very nice if we had anthropologists coming from America who didn't want to study impoverished Black people, academics, it would be great. But I want to tell you one story about gossip that circulated and for a long time. And I'm choosing it for two reasons. One, it's so well known that no one's going to come and say I made it up because enough people have heard it. But two, it really illuminates something. It illuminates that what happened goes beyond a defense of professional turf. The story can be summarized in a single sentence. This is the claim in this gossip. Abehlali Basumjondolo held a nighttime ceremony on a beach in which an animal was slaughtered and a white man made the king of the beach. It's a deeply democratic. Now, the fact that such a ludicrous story can be believed and repeated by academics with good jobs and good universities over some years illuminates the extent to which rationality has been, in Du Bois's terms, devastated by passion and belief. The fact that the story sounds like it comes straight out of the colonial novels, the colonial fiction of Rider Haggard, who actually wrote in South Africa and lived in Durban at one point, illuminates the racist nature of that passion, of its undeniable coloniality. Du Bois's method to engage the oppressed as ordinary human beings, to insist on standards of ethics and research, and to clearly distinguish between fact and desire remains urgently relevant. Thank you.
All right, we will invite Rudo Mudiwa for discussion remarks.
Thank you, Richard. That was really fantastic and really productive for all of us to think with. And I'm just gonna sort of respond to this in a number of ways that I hope will connect to something meaningful for you all. And I'm gonna respond to this sort of an anecdote that I hope is illustrative of what you're talking about and the kinds of problems that emerged in the narration of history. So a few nights ago, in the fit of insomnia, I was watching Charlie Rose. I sort of ended up somehow looking at Charlie Rose's archives. That's sort of immaterial, but also important. And I started watching an interview that he did with historian Annette Gordon-Reed in 1997. And in that interview, she was discussing the forthcoming book, The Hemmings of Monticello, which established, contrary to the prevailing historiography at the time, that Thomas Jefferson had not only been engaged in a sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, who is his half-sister, the half-sister of his wife, who was, as the story goes, right, given to the couple by Jefferson's father-in-law, but he had also crucially fathered children with her. While this is now, thanks to Reed's work, an acknowledged historical fact, at that time, in 1997, Reed was actually embroiled in a controversy. The footage featured one prominent biographer of Jefferson who called this, quote, a moral impossibility. Rose asks Reed how she managed to push against the weight of the American historical establishment to do this painstaking work to trace the genealogy of the silent descendants of this Black woman. And Annette Gordon-Reed, who I just think is fantastic, characteristically unflappable, too modest, right, given the weight of what she's taking on in this particular moment. She says that she simply listened to the stories of the Black descendants of Sally Hemings, and she took them seriously. Now, this was not like a complete discovery that she had made. Historians had gestured to the presence, the alleged presence of descendants, right? But it was always consigned to gossip. There may have been children that were fathered, but he couldn't have done it. It was, to quote his biographer, a moral possibility that he could have done. Not only could he have enslaved people, right, but gone so far as to maintain this relationship with an enslaved woman, to father children that he then also enslaved, right? It was a moral possibility. So Reed produces this groundbreaking work that pushes back against, right, the historical establishment simply by doing the work of listening to Black people. A really simple idea, which as Richard Pithouse demonstrates, can have radical implications. What does it mean to take seriously the words of Black people, to substantiate their, not to substantiate, but to think of their testimony as legitimate? But of course, there's always an apparatus in place which makes sure that this work is impossible. As usual, we are spoken about and not spoken to, Abashadi says. So from Du Bois, Pithouse takes the idea that Black people's capacity for agency and rationality is assumed to be absent, such that this shapes the narration of history. And I thought this was interesting that this is an inversion of the charge of irrationality, right? So the person who's irrational here is not the Black subject, but rather it's a historian who has what we would call, right, sort of an irrational attachment, and I'm using the term attachment specifically here, to a docile Black subject. And when we think about what psychic attachments do, right, they produce something for the person who has the attachment. So if you have an irrational attachment, if you went to therapy, right, the goal would be to work out, like, what is this attachment doing for you? Why, what is productive about this attachment? And so that was really helpful for me to think with, right? Because Du Bois points out that this is, as Richard then, right, elaborates in his paper, that there's an affective component to this, right? It's not just a material investment in the silencing of Black people. There's an affective dimension to this silence. And that was, for me, the important point. So what does this psychic attachment do? Why is it necessary? Why do we have to reproduce a docile Black subject? And right, there's so much going on here, sort of like psychoanalytically, because the people then who write about these subjects are then assumed to have a sort of naive romanticism. And you have this charge and counter-charge of irrationality. And you have institutions that then work to reproduce this attachment to the docile Black subject. You have the ANC, the NGO industrial complex, the media, and crucially, the academy itself. And so what I wanted to do in the second part of my response, which will be very brief, is to try to think with Richard from Zimbabwe, right? South Africa's perpetually in crisis neighbor, and that crisis, right, has its historical roots, and there are people who are invested in the production of that crisis. And I want to write about a moment that I've been recently thinking with, about a series of strikes that take place in 1980. So much like South Africa, Zimbabwe also has a negotiated transition for its independence, right? And we have the Lancaster House Agreement in 1979. Then the election takes place in 1980. And there's always an assumption in historiography that the break with dominant party, which is ZANU-PF, which is the party that takes power at independence, starts much later, right in the 1990s, as the middle class revolts, and then formally challenges Robert Mugabe, formally establishes, right, an opposition party that challenges Mugabe. And as I was doing some archival work for this book that I'm currently writing, when I was looking at newspaper accounts, I kept encountering stories of strikes that took place in the interregnum, So the election, Zimbabwe's election takes place in March 1980. And the independence ceremony takes place in April. So you have a month-long period in which ZANU-PF is not formally in power. And during that month-long period, the British, who had long abandoned Rhodesia because, for a variety of reasons which I can explain in the Q&A, they come back and they appoint an interim governor. So during that time, Rhodesia, soon to become Zimbabwe, is under interim British governance. And as I was doing my own research, looking at newspaper accounts, I kept seeing accounts of wildcat strikes that took place during this month-long window. And I hadn't really read anything about these strikes. And you would see, right, in every newspaper, disturbance at a mine in Shangani, disturbance at, one thing that I read, I remember reading a story about teachers walk off the job, right? Students stone schools. And there were these sort of scattered accounts of clearly something, right? Some unrest taking place during this month-long period. And we've been having this conversation, right, throughout the quarter. It's come up about the idea of spontaneity, which Richard touched on in this paper. And right, it seemed to have the characteristics of this kind of spontaneous moment. And that to me was so exciting and generative to think there is an interregnum, right, which is this window, right? Zimbabwe is not yet, it's coming, but it's not yet there. So there's a certain kind of like potentiality that is in that moment. And to have citizens enacting that potentiality by going on strikes. Now, of course, during the colonial period, there had been Black trade unions that had organized workers because of their exclusion from the formal white union leadership. So they had organized their own unions, which were severely suppressed, right? They couldn't do a lot of things, and one of the things that they could not do was strike. So the wildcat strike was this mechanism that Black trade unions had used sparingly, but they had used. But in this moment, even the Black trade unions do not know what is going on. So in the accounts that I was reading, they would have leaders saying, we didn't organize this, right? We don't know what's happening. We have to call our membership to account because we didn't organize this. And, Richard cites Fanon, and you have this dynamic where the trade union leadership, right, in the Zimbabwe to come are going to be the elites, right? These are people who had affiliations to the major political parties. They are nationalist elites themselves, right? And if you know about the history of like the formation of nationalist parties in Southern Africa, there was often a relationship between trade unions and such. So these are people who are going to become elites. So they also have an investment in not causing too much trouble during the interregnum because they have affiliations with political parties. So they're essentially saying, we don't know, right? We don't know what's going on here. We are not organizing these strikes. So these are wildcat strikes that are taking place during this window of opportunity. And as I was thinking about this, right, first of all, we have these strikes that seem to be important, but nobody's really paying attention to them. And like, how do we talk about them? I, much like Richard, turn to Fanon. And there's always, right, in the way that Fanon writes, there's always sort of language that helps you to theorize something in a really productive way. And Fanon had talked about a time lag or a difference in rhythm between elites and masses. And that accounting of rhythm, right, that metaphor, rhythm, so both the time lag, like that language is really important for me, and a difference in rhythm. And I know that there are debates about like which translation does one use, the Wilcox or forget the Farrington. So in one, it is time lag, and the other it is out of step, right? Elites and masses have a time lag or they are out of step. And so that became productive for me to think with, right, how in this moment do we see how institutions like the major nationalist parties, the trade unions, are fundamentally out of step or always have a difference in rhythm with, right, the working people who at this point engage in wildcat strikes. And when I was doing this work, you saw that none of the newspapers directly quote any of the workers. Oftentimes, they will quote the factory owners who will say, we don't know why they're doing this, right? Thereby reproducing the trope of the irrational Black subject. We don't know why they're doing this, right? And of course, crucially, just as Richard points out, there are always stories that there's a nefarious third party who is causing the strikes. So a friend of mine generously sent me archives from British diplomatic cables, where they are speculating that the strikes are the cause of the opposition parties that have been recently defeated, right? And a term that I really enjoyed reading was disgruntled worker elements, right? Disgruntled worker elements. And there's a really, when I was, starting to sort of collect documents, there is a really interesting letter to the editor that somebody sends during this time, where they tell a story that they were at a shopping center and they saw somebody going around the shopping center asking workers if they were being mistreated. And they said, this is what we're talking about. There's somebody who's causing this, right? And this is kind of showing the nature. So this is clearly, there is organization happening here, but there's always this sort of mystification of, we don't know why this is happening. So this person is describing what is kind of like, that is organizing, right? Someone is going around asking workers about their grievances and then trying to organize them. And the way it's narrated in the newspaper is, we saw someone at a shopping center asking workers if they're being treated badly, and who is doing this, right? So we see these similar features happening across post-independence Africa. The idea that like worker action is innately suspect, the idea that it must only be the cause of nefarious third parties, right? The absolute denial of any kind of agency. And, so this trying to track these strikes has been really difficult, in part because there is no document of workers themselves. But you have these really, in the things I found, you've had these really telling moments. For example, the Associated Press reports that one strike began after a white supervisor spat on some Black employees. You have another strike where you have a sign posted outside of the factory telling workers that they're on strike, right? So part of the challenge for me has been, of course, not only trying to like locate people who participate in these strikes and are still, right, some of them are still alive, and talking to them about how did this happen, but also about trying to talk about what these kinds of moments, the kind of potentiality that was embedded in these moments. And one that I think when we think about what the Academy does, and I think especially when we think about writing, not only on Zimbabwe, but on Africa, tries to dismiss the kind of revolutionary potential of independence, because now we sort of have this obligatory pessimism about what those moments represented. And that's one that I try to push against, because I think that it's important to always think like these moments once meant something, and the people who were participating in them thought that something important was happening. And I think it's important for us to like take that seriously, rather than to say, well, of course they were doomed to fail. Of course, these projects were never going to amount to anything, because of course, capital was always going to reassert itself. For me, I think it's important to like recover and to think about, right, what it meant to live in 1980, and to think that you as a worker, because there was a Black government is coming in, something is going to change. And these strikes are a testament to that. So thinking about these wildcat strikes has enabled me to think about what it means to have the potentiality. And a couple weeks ago, I think it was Joshua Clover who talked about what it means to be organized by the conditions, right? To have these moments that, and it's not spontaneity in a sort of mystifying way, but these moments that push people into political action. And of course, as Richard rightly points out, like, right, there are people there who were probably informal political organizations who had experience in this kind of work. But what it means to recover that potentiality, and what it means to write against, right, the reproduction of a docile Black subject. I think it's a really, really important challenge, and I think that you know, in a partial answer of like, why does the academy reproduce this attachment? I think because resisting it produces too much friction, right? It's much easier and smoother to assume that nothing is happening in such moments than to actually go back and try to tease them out. So the attachment is enjoyable if we're like thinking like psychoanalytically, because it is a frictionless one in my mind. And that's part of why reproduction is so easy. So thank you, Richard, for allowing me to think with you on this, and I'm happy to continue talking about this in Q&A.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Rudo, and thank you, Richard, for these remarks. We're now going to open it up to a Q&A with all of you and with our Zoom audience. For those people who are joining us via Zoom, you can type your questions into the Q&A box and I will read them aloud to our speakers. We don't have a mic at their table, so we'll ask them to speak up as much as possible, answering any questions. So who would like to get us started in the Q&A? Yeah, go ahead, Timmy. If you can speak as loudly as possible, that'd be great.
Okay, hopefully online can hear me with this volume. Okay, thank you both. Given us a lot to think about here, and this is just kind of one of my first thoughts, so hopefully it makes sense. So as we're thinking through the importance and the role of unofficial media in the production of propaganda, production of history, and the propaganda that informs history. What are your provocations, or what do you think might be helpful in considering these sort of new kinds of communication, maybe social media, maybe unofficial, I don't know, gathering spaces, when we're thinking about how these stories are told? Yeah, what happens when we think about media of today through a Du Boisian perspective? How does what comes up for you when you think about that?
Why don't you go ahead and respond?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I can only answer it from my understanding of where I am intellectually and politically engaged. And the first point is that, you know, all that, you know, I mean, I remember in the early 2000s, people were writing papers saying that what they called in this horrible academic jargon, ICTs, information and communication technology. It's going to be this amazing democratizing force. And then, of course, it got really ridiculous with the Arab Spring in 2011. People were writing, if it was in the New York Times or the Washington Post or somewhere like that, that, you know, this is the Twitter revolution. You know, like the technology caused the uprising, and yeah, American technologies are going to revolutionize, or at least democratize the world. I mean, the first thing is that in most of the world, those aren't democratic technologies. I mean, a very small percentage of people in South Africa are on Twitter. Data, price you pay to get online, it's very, very expensive. And it's very expensive because the state won't regulate it and they won't deal with profiteering by cell phone companies. And it's much cheaper next door in Namibia because the states have a charge. Often that sphere, that online sphere, shapes other kinds of media. A lot of journalists sit in the newsroom looking at Twitter. They're looking at an elite space and a space that has other biases in terms of age as well as, you know, class. And in South Africa, Twitter is brutally sexist. when like right-wing forces want to attack like a journalist who's reporting something. It's just disgusting. So it's also toxic and it drives people out. And of course, it's not, the point about, trying to put together a good seminar series or editing the journal well or editing the newspaper well, is that you try and create a space that's as rational as possible. Of course, the issues of, is News 24 rational in South Africa? It's not automatic. But, we've had these problems, and I know they've happened elsewhere of like, when Jacob Zuma, former president who ran a repressive kleptocracy, was under real pressure. He went to, he went to a right-wing PR company in London that had represented Pinochet and Thatcher, and they were running a huge social media campaign. It's really distorted in that way too. And like I mentioned, these 3 young people who were assassinated in Durban last year. That's accompanied by fake Facebook profiles. And it's crude. You look at the profile and they haven't made a post before and they've got no friends. It's not sophisticated, but claiming, no, actually Abahlali murdered these people, it's internal. This is just the local ANC. It's not sophisticated. But it isn't a space of it isn't a space that is easily an alternative. It also produces a lot of gossip and stuff that isn't true that make it into more authorized forms of knowledge that are archived. There are some nice things about it. If you look at the Abahlali Facebook page, excuse me, they got like 10,000 followers. And it's a small proportion of their members who are on there. But you will see things like every week, like yesterday they launched a branch in a sort of small rural town in the Eastern Cape called Designer. And there's some photographs from that branch. They're not great photographs, they're taken on someone's phone. They're not representing people in a way that middle-class people are represented as elegant, beautiful, and they're just photographs. But you can at least see that happened. It becomes very difficult, like it was in 2005 or 2006, to just say this is not happening. This is all just lies and fraud. Because there is a picture there. And there are videos from meetings. It's not like a whole speech is there. It's a clip. But you can see who's, if you see a photograph or a video from one of the big, call them general assemblies that Abahlali has on our first Sunday of every month in Durban. If you see, for instance, that they begin with the Internationale, then there's a Christian prayer, and then there's African spiritual practices. You can't say that these people that intellectuals have imposed their own left-wing fantasies on it, because why are there hundreds of people singing Internationale? You can't say that they are xenophobic, because why is the priest or the pastor who's leading the prayer Congolese guy? And he's also a left-wing guy. He's part of a thing called the campaign for the Congolese Solidarity campaign, which is kind of lumberous. So it does constrain the things that can be said, just because there are some facts there. But it isn't a solution, and it's very, very classed in terms of access. But it has been better just having that Facebook page and having photographs and videos, But it's not like the US. It's not like, from what I understand, the role of social media in Black Lives Matter was at a completely different level to anything you could imagine.
Yeah, Ariel.
Thank you both for your remarks. And,
Project as much as possible for us.
thank you both for your remarks. I think it's really interesting that you are speaking Fanon and Bois together, because it's not something that I've read often, or at all actually. And I think that the quotes you pulled were really interesting. And one of the things I want to ask you about was, how do you distinguish between delusion and duplicity? Because I think for me, like, when I hear the word delusion, I'm thinking of some kind of like mental state that is, where there is real belief, like there is really the assumption that there's truth. And I think in reading Black Reconstruction, the chapter on the white working class is really interesting because there is, like, at least I think the Bois is arguing that there is this sincere belief that there is some kind of material benefit that will come out of believing or kind of aligning with the planter class. And but then the kind of argument maybe shifts when he starts to talk about Andrew Jackson, who was a part of the white working class, who held these beliefs, but then when introduced into a new positionality, having a different type of access and class, he still chooses to have, you know, the same kind of racist and or anti-Black orientation. And so I'm just wondering, yeah, if you can talk about, like, when you say, you know, Du Bois's call to distinguish between fact and desire is still relevant, what are we actually looking for when we're trying to make that distinguish, that discern, like, how do we have that discernment when so much of kind of illusion for me is like maybe actually a highly mediated project or meditated project, and we can't so much look for it simply in who's speaking, but like, what are the motivations for that speech? And yeah, does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. I think it's really, really important and very clearly explained. I mean, delusion and duplicity. You know, you probably can't draw an absolute line between them. I mean, some people would be duplicitous because they deluded and think the lie needs to be made because of other things they believe. And duplicity obviously shapes delusion. But in terms of what I was talking about, they both play. I mean, you know, the ANC, I'm sure, sincerely believed that suddenly there are thousands of criminals pretending to be a political organization. They sincerely believed that there's some nefarious external racially distinguished actor controlling these people. It's not true, but they believe it. But they also lie. You know, they specifically lie about repression. You know, like if the police killed someone, well, you know, the police officer was under attack, blah, 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 whatever. You know, they lie. And they lie in crude ways. I mean, we used to have a city manager called Michael Sutcliffe, who was a Marxist, studied here in the US, Ohio State University, and got an award for the radical geography or whatever. I mean, he would do something like ban a march and then go to the media and say, oh no, the reason why the march didn't go ahead is because the leaders of the movement came to me and asked me to please stop it because they've been forced to do this. You know, just straight up lies. And it was the same with that academic NGO Nexus, mostly delusion. People sincerely believing these things because of that investment in the APRA. They just do not believe it, that impoverished African people have political capacities. You know, it's what Du Bois talks about. But there's also that line. I mean, when I talked about those documents that were circulated that like were intelligent style, a few facts and this fabrication. I mean, I'm sure that mostly delusion there. That guy might have believed that the red color was imposed because that's just how prejudicial he is. There's also a lot of straight up lying. I mean, for me, reading Du Bois was very useful because straight up lying and gossip are just normally ignored. We just, you know, it's there, but we just don't take it seriously. He's saying you absolutely have to take it seriously because it's shaping authorized forms of knowledge. You know, I've never spoken about this stuff in an academic context before because it's just that craziness over there. But it's that craziness that shapes a lot of the academic stuff, continues to do so. You know, like really smart people trained at really good universities here in the US are still citing that stuff. And I think the link with gossip is important because if you hear a story like the one I told, that one line thing. You're never going to, and you believe it, you're never going to think that reports of people who've been described in that way, having courage, integrity, political vision, I mean, actually succeeding in building a movement of all the middle class people have never been able to do it. You're not going to believe it's true. I don't know how to say here's a formula for separating between fact and desire, but I think it's a useful phrase. It's a great phrase, and it must be applied to everyone. You know, I mean, if you are writing about people who are genuinely scorned, you've also got to, you know, be as rigorous as you can to draw that distinction. But it's the people, you made this point so well, it's the people who are writing about those kinds of people who are always accused of being romantic and, you know, not scientifically serious and so on. It's the people who are writing from the dominant perspective who are not ever assumed to be animated by desire that's overwhelming fact. So, I mean, applying that lens uniformly, and yeah, I mean, maybe in a way it's related to the strictly axiomatic universal affirmation of humanity, strictly axiomatic affirmation of a universal imperative to distinguish between this. But it's a challenge. There's no formula. It's work. You probably just do that work your whole life. And you get some things right, you get some things wrong, you read other people, have other conversations, you just keep on with it. But if you know what you're trying to do, and you don't have this naivety that the people who work in universities and publish in journals and have degrees from fancy universities are immune from it. In fact, they could be replicating it. You're going to be in a much better position. Like the voice says, you won't be like this.
I wanted to ask you maybe two follow-up questions. One, it has to do, you mentioned in the case of Haiti, the kind of small, militant, but insignificant kind of Trotskyist group. And that brought up for me, part of our conversation, the last 48 hours, kind of different political and intellectual traditions in South Africa on the left. So one, in the midst of, I think, those different formations came up in your talk, kind of, in addition to just like generalized ignorance and propaganda. So I'm wondering about the complicity of the left, which I think Du Bois is also thinking about and intervening into. How is it that we understand the Black worker, right, as an actor in American history? How do we reinsert this period of Reconstruction back into the history of radical revolutionary moments? And in your case, how do we think of the struggles of the poor in South Africa as a part of militant struggles, despite the fact that our epistemological frames constantly prevent us from understanding that? So what have you could give us just more, first question is just give us a sense of the lay of the land of left political formations in South Africa, because there are so many of them, and some of the intricacies involved there, and how some of those formations relate to or don't relate to movements coming from the poor that are much more autonomous and democratic. I know that's a very general question. The second question I had is related to this question of race and class. That's obviously central to Black Reconstruction and to your account of South Africa and Rudo's account of Zimbabwe at this moment of transition. And on the one hand, it seems like the traditional entrenched powers, right? You told us a story of Afrikaner-owned media being held up as rational, and they're connected to Afrikaner capital and telling straight up lies and not doing any actual journalistic work about the poor. But on the other hand, the racializing of an outsider, a white figure that comes in to control the Black poor whenever they want to act for themselves, is also a discourse mobilized by, as you mentioned, the new Black government and Black middle class. And this maps on, I think, the same situation in Zimbabwe. And in that case, so the people doing the accusations of an outsider who has to speak on behalf of the Black poor are also themselves Black and engaged in a struggle for power. So what are the different forms of coming together of race and class, and specifically in the context of the enfranchised now and in government, whether it's in the ANC or leaders of trade unions, kind of bureaucratized the left, and how are they relating to the Black poor in this context? And are there any lessons? I know this may be one of the moments where the historical period is quite different, 1865, 1994, as you mentioned, in terms of the different substratas of the working class and the middle and upper classes as they fight their battles, but all of which is still permeated by race and like an underlying kind of inability to understand Black actors as thinking beings and as people who can determine their own destiny, might take their own positions. So unscramble a little bit. Those are rambling questions. One about some of these left formations that are involved in the history of South Africa, how they relate to the economists, more economist poor. The other one is like, how is race and class coming together, especially with a now Black-led government, to continue this tradition of erasing the struggles of the Black poor?
Yeah, those are interesting and deep questions, and I don't know if I can answer them, but even a serious attempt would take a long time, and I feel like I'm really speaking right here. But excuse me. Look, the key point I wanted to make in the talk, and I think it's a little bit longer in the written version, which one person has read, is that okay, there's always diversity, but from that moment when Biko introduces power of Fred, and then there's the strikes in Durban, and you begin this development of like, 20-year sequence of popular struggle. The dominant ideas that intellectuals, university trained intellectuals who go into trade unions, whether it's have, are all premised on this mutuality. And I mentioned that phrase on mutual currents of currents of mutual enlightenment. That was the idea, that people could learn from each other. And it's not unusual. I mean, Walter Rodney talks about that. Sylvia Winter talks. A lot of people talk about it. Marx talks about suffering human beings. You think he adds that, There were always obviously more dogmatic, sectarian groups around, but because there was a huge movement, millions of people, they were completely marginal. I think a lot of the people who were part of those movements, after the transition, as I said, they went into state NGOs, or they just decided they've done their bit. They could, I don't know, learn to play the cello or something. And it's fair enough they did do their bit. But those small groups came to the fore. And they got funding through NGOs and through donors, often kind of liberal donors in the West. Why is a liberal donor in the West funding a small sectarian group? I don't even know if NGO Trotskyism really exists anywhere else in the world, but it certainly exists in South Africa. And I didn't talk about this in the paper, but even the arguments that there should be this mutuality, that there should be this dialogical relationship, was dismissed as ridiculous, romantic. And there's something about a claim on modernity that goes with that kind of politics. And the assumption that not all African people, but poor African people with rural backgrounds are not modern. And that we as the enlightened vanguard have got the politics. We need to bring it and impose it on people in their own interests. That just sounds like the logic of colonialism. It really does. you don't want to make too many sweeping, or I don't want to make too many sweeping statements about the sort of topography of the left because it's changing, it's complicated, but basically you have a left still in the ANC that's organized around the and some of the trade unions there, and they make important critiques of aspects of government policy, and they take positions on international issues and so on. But they don't support movements outside of the ANC, which is where struggle is most intense. There has been in some trade unions a very similar contempt for poor people to that you see in the society and NGOs. I mean, Zwelinzima Vabi is quite notorious, like phone people the day before he has a march, say, please come here. Just assume that people have nothing better to do than show up at your march. You don't give them the courtesy of having a meeting with them. You just want poor people to make up your numbers. They don't have any role in deciding. It's totally different if a trade union said, look, let's have a meeting, let's work out a common program. No, that's great. There is that contempt for impoverished people is across the board. But there are no little factions of middle class people on the left who are able to at the moment engage productively with popular struggles. All of them have failed. That's why I said you had a generation from 73 to 1990 of intellectuals, university training, who were incredibly effective. And I think we need to start saying that the post-apartheid generation, with lots of disclaimers about individuals and projects that have worked and so on, basically, overall, is a failed generation. And they haven't taken responsibility for that. And when you don't, I think about Bois and like psychological investments and things, it's much easier to just blame other people. I mean, I didn't mention it in the talk, but in the notes here, I said it's like Groundhog Day, except that they are always arriving at the Finland station, and there's no one to greet them. You come back the next day, there's no one to greet you. So what do? You either change your thinking about politics, your ideas, or you start blaming someone else or something else. And the psychological temptation to do the latter, I think, is quite profound. It's complicated, and I didn't try and theorize it. And to be honest, I would be, if I can borrow another phrase from Bois, groping in the dark. So how is it that overwhelmingly Black political organization, the ANC, which of course in itself was accused all the time of being under white control. I mean, when I was a kid at school in the 80s, we would get like these organograms, so this leads to this, it's like this leads to this. And right at the top is Joe Slovo, a white Jewish communist. This guy is really behind it all. Actually, people were happy, they really are happy. They're actually being forced to protest and stuff by these terrible ANC people, but they're all controlled by this cunning, manipulative. It's anti-Semitic too. They choose a Jewish guy. It's done to the ANC. Why are they doing it? I mean, part of it, I think, you spoke about nationalism, and obviously something we really have to take seriously in the settler colony in Southern Africa, because Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, elite nationalism. Because, what is that? It's a claim to represent the nation. And it's a claim to represent the nation outside of and prior to formal democratic processes. And it's a claim in a way to unity. So it is, as it is for like the NGO left, a sort of problem when like the NGO left say, well, we will represent the oppressed. Oh, now that they're coming into political action, we'll represent them. Oh, they don't want us to give them instructions. That's a problem. Let's blame someone for it. If you're the ANC, we represent the people. And the claim is we especially represent the most oppressed, the most marginalized. Now they are making it very clear that they don't want you to represent. In fact, they're calling you oppressors. it's probably politically and psychologically difficult, and you can't sustain your claim to nationalist politics with that happening without delegitimating those people and the struggle. And I suppose an easy way of delegitimating them, and Fanon talks about exactly this, is to say, well, it may appear that there are 5,000 people on the streets asking for their dignity to be respected and for radical land reform to be implemented. This is what may appear. This is what they're saying, what their banners say. But really, there's a white person who's funded by a white government somewhere else in the world, in the West, who's trying to undermine us. No, I mean, it's not persuasive, it's ridiculous. But I suppose it's functional in that way. But I don't think that that fully explains it. I think that you have to take, and you ask race and class seriously. And this sort of thinking that people are, look, I can't remember the name of the person who said this, but after the French Revolution, one of the people in the revolution said, when there were like criticisms and organization after the revolution, said, it's a wonderful phrase, this must have been organized by perfidious aristocrats in disguise. So they're all white then, it's not race. But this idea that people lower down the social hierarchy can't possibly have ideas and conceive political strategies and implement them. It's race and class. And of course, when that intersects, it's particularly virulent. But it can apply purely in the context of race and purely in the context of class. And look, there is also such a thing as internalized racism. I mean, that's what Nico talks about. And nationalism is also a modernist ideology. It absolutely is. And this idea that some people have yet to be brought into modernity is powerful. But what's fascinating to me is that the stereotypes that used to be directed against all people in South Africa cannot be directed against middle class people anymore. They will not publicly, but they are openly directed the same against poor people. And this is not, I use Abushali as an example, but think about Marikon. This is when mine workers and the platinum mines go on strike in 2012, wildcat strike, outside of the control of the unions. And all the same things happen. I mean, the ANC at one point does say that there's a white person behind it. Business Day, newspaper of capital, and the best newspaper in the country in the sense that it's the only serious one. They just degenerate into talking quote tribesmen from rural villages in Pondo land. It's like these people are not able to be part of modern society. What could be more modern than people who've been dispossessed by colonialism, forced into migrant labor, are working in platinum mines that are producing the platinum for catalytic converters for cars made in Germany? And these people are completely implicated in the modern world, but they're just rendered as not modern. And that seems to legitimate a whole lot of stereotypes, but they are stereotypes that have a history of being anti-African, but are now legitimately, in scare quotes, directed at certain people. And I think there are people who experience themselves as modern, who are African people, who repeat those stereotypes. I had this as a teacher. I had children of elites, like children of powerful people in the ANC, like in the class of 400 students, stand up and express like straight up genocidal desires about the poor,
Thank you for that. I know that we have to vacate this room in about 3 minutes, but I want to give the last word to our Zoom audience, and in particular to my comrade Damien Joyner, who says, thank you so much for this dynamic engagement. I have a question for Richard. Your insights and comments were powerful and needed, in particular, given the instability of the current moment. You made note of Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's silencing of the past and the making of propaganda by the state. I cannot help but to think of his book in concert with Cedric Robinson's Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, with regard to the fragility of racial regimes as being extremely hostile to their exhibition. Given the Southern African context, is it a fair assessment to state that the violence of Southern African state is in response to movement building by those who are rendered not human as a way to prevent the absurdity, violence, general horrid nature of racial capitalism within Southern Africa? And if so, in the current moment, what are examples, anecdotes of such movement building and liberation struggle? And if time, their possible genealogical connections to previous struggles? So you have about 90 seconds to answer that fantastic series of questions, and we can continue the conversation.
Amazing question, but it would have to be like a book as long as Black Reconstruction. I mean, I really found this idea that's in the question of fragility interesting, because when power is self-assured, it can handle critique and just laugh it off, you know. I mean, you know, I don't know, think about parents with a small child, and the child says something and they just pat the child on the head, and you know, they don't get stressed. Like the fact that there's such fragility, this paranoia just beneath the surface, whether it's in that NGO academic complex or in the state, I think it's really an amazing insight, because it must mean that at least at an unconscious level, if not consciously, they know that this whole system is like a house of cards. And I mean, why else would you be so paranoid? I mean, why did the ANC literally try and piece Abercrombie out of existence? They treated it like an illegal organization. I mean, if people put on their red shirts and took their banners and stood collectively, there was like militarized police in there. They tried to step out of the shack settlement, they got attacked. Why? Why are you so scared? If you are confident in your power, why not just say, well, sure, have your march, it's cool. And that in a way is, you know, if the head that wears the crown doesn't sleep easy, that's kind of encouraging if you're not on the side of the crown. The genealogies question is amazing, because I remember early on sitting in a meeting in the Kennedy Road settlements, a Shining meeting, and like everyone else who was present in that space, but also the university space, it's just was so weird, because the one is supposed to be the official institutional home of reason and rationality, and the other's not. But what's happening in the university space is completely deluded. And I mean, I remember sitting in the meeting and thinking, okay, so no, there's supposed to be no political capacity here. At best, the people who live here must be subject to training. That's always, they've got to be trained, workshop by NGOs. Who's in the room? Well, wasn't the room, but who's in the meeting? It's like, well, first of all, there was an old man who always used to come and introduce himself as the grandson of Bambata. Bambata led an anti-colonial, armed anti-colonial rebellion in 1906. I kind of assumed he was speaking metaphorically. He wasn't. He was a grandson of Bambata. You know, imagine the stories he must have grown up with in his family. There were two people there whose fathers and uncles had both been involved in the Pondo Rebellion in 1960. You know, sort of really the last, in a way, anti-colonial insurgency in defense of pre-existing hold on land. Imagine the stories they grew up. Interestingly, a lot of the people who organized those strikes in Marikana came from similar kinds of families. That's another story. But there was, I mean, I sort of mentioned this in passing in the talk. I was thinking about this meeting. There was a guy who had been at school in the Eastern Cape and had this teacher who was a real intellectual, but was also an alcoholic. And because he was an alcoholic, he couldn't get a good job. So he was teaching in this poor rural school. And as much as he was an alcoholic, he was a biology teacher. He told the kids about politics every day. He'd been in the Black consciousness movement. So there was that tradition, you know. There, of course, were people who'd been in the UDF. there was someone who had a leadership position in the local, in the local branch of the metal workers. There's trade unions, there's UDF, there's Black consciousness. Of course, there were people in the ANC, which has, I mean, as much as we have a problem with the ANC now, it has a political history. This rich array of political experience in the room. And they come together. And people draw on other things as well. I mean, people draw on pre-colonial practices that are more present in rural contexts. That's where the commitment to deliberation and to slow consensus seeking practices comes. It's hybridized, it's mixed. It's always changing, it's not one thing. But certainly with Abahlali, what is fundamentally grounded, and it's the same there with that axiomatic statement by Laplace, a person is a person. Every person is a person, must be recognized as a person, must be treated with proper dignity. And anything or anyone that doesn't do that, we have a legitimate right to rebel. That's the foundation of the rebellion. And that is a politics that you could call Africanist. I'm not saying it doesn't appear elsewhere in the world, but the resources people are drawing for that, that is where it comes from. And it is, you know, they engage communist ideas and socialist ideas. I mean, part of their political education, they use a sort of 19th, I think it's 19th century anarchist picture of like of hierarchy. But those things are engaged from that fundamental moral position, and it does give people courage and strength. But as much as, you know, people are literally willing to risk their lives for those things, and sometimes give their lives for those things, at the end of the day, there is no force in South Africa that has the power to achieve anything like an abolition of this, not even close. So the scale that would be required would be much more like the scale, relatively speaking, proportion that Laplace achieved in Haiti. Everything I read about Laplace sounds like I was like, but the scale is not the same. I don't know how long it took to build Laplace, Laplace. Abahlali is growing, but I mean, it would have to sort of, I don't know, I mean, if you've got 120,000 members, if everyone could recruit 10 members, you'd be a lot bigger than next year. I mean, it's so impossible. But right now, things are getting worse. People are getting poorer. The society is getting more violent. Institutions are degrading. There are less jobs, deindustrializing. Most young people do not have work and will never have work. It's like 60%. For people of all ages, unemployment is 42%. It's what Fanon called a non-viable society, a society to be replaced. And there are grave dangers that, as in many other parts of the world, I think from India or whatever, that opportunists could try and capitalize on that in very, very dangerous ways. There are a lot of people trying to build a xenophobic politics, which what it actually means is a politics hostile to in particular poor and working class immigrants from elsewhere in Africa and Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan as well. But it certainly affects middle class people too, but not necessarily in a violent way. That is terrifying. And it's possible that the progressive tradition could be almost extinguished if something like that built enough traction.
Well, not very sobering. Note the urgency of thinking Black Reconstruction as a portal of understanding the specter of fascism, authoritarianism. It will bring this fantastic, very lively conversation to a close. And thank you once again, Richard, for wonderful talk, and thank you, Rudo, for the fantastic set of discussant remarks. Thanks to all of you for your questions. Thanks to our Zoom audience, who I can see is also yet again zooming in from around the world, literally. So thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation and for all our prior conversations. We look forward to continuing it with all of you in the future.